When there's a significant security breach, it's very likely we're going to use some computer forensics to dive deeper in detailing and documenting what took place. Let's begin. Let's take Bob's computer here for a moment, and let's imagine that we've done a lot of work beforehand to protect that endpoint computer. We put antivirus software, we have anti-malware software, we also have updates that are being done regularly. Life is great. So if there is, for whatever reason, malware introduced onto Bob's machine, either through a USB drive or from a web page that he visited, the intent is that the software we've already put on that system to protect against that will identify that there's a problem, that there's malicious software. It will quarantine it so the malicious software can't propagate, especially if it's a worm that might otherwise have the ability to propagate across the network or to other components of Bob's system, and then finally remove the malicious software. And then we could go back to the log files and take a look at exactly what happened regarding that incident. Now that's in a perfect world, but what if we have some malware or some other type of incident that happens on Bob's computer that isn't automatically handled by our software running on Bob's computer? For example, maybe one of our network devices, the gateway or some other device in line, notices that from Bob's computer we're sending out 100 megabytes per day of ICMP traffic. And as we look inside the ICMP, they're not ping requests. It's some encrypted content that we are not sure what's inside. But there's like 100 megabytes per day that are being sent out. Now, as that is noticed by the network infrastructure, that would be an incident. There's a problem. Something malicious is very likely happening, and it's involving Bob's computer. So now that we've identified it, we might want to quarantine that or stop it from happening. Maybe at the firewall or the gateway, we stop that traffic. We block Bob's traffic so it can't propagate out. And then we might enter a process called digital forensics or computer forensics, where we would capture, preserve, and then analyze the data that we have available to better understand what exactly is happening. Now, one of the challenges is if we turn off Bob's computer, we're going to lose a lot of volatile information that we may have otherwise collected. And the order of volatility regarding what information might go away very easily if we're not careful would be anything that's in random access memory or RAM in Bob's computer. So that could include things like register information, cache, process tables, system information, and anything else that is sitting in RAM or part of RAM. So if we turn Bob's machine off, all of that information that was in RAM is going to be flushed. It's gone. We can't analyze it if it's not there. For example, one of the processes is called ARP, Address Resolution Protocol. If Bob needs to discover another local device's layer 2 address, he'll ARP for it. Well, how many other devices had Bob ARP for, and how many were in the ARP cache? Well, if we turn off the computer and reboot it, we won't know what the previous ARP cache looked like, because it'll all be lost when we power off the computer. Another cache type might be RAID. If Bob's computer has a RAID system for fault tolerance, and there's a RAID cache involved, that's another cache that will be flushed when we turn off that computer. Another type of cache would be a CPU cache. What was the actual CPU currently about to work on? So anything involving cached information is very volatile, and we're likely to lose that if we power off that computer. So as far as forensics goes, in collecting that information, it would be a great idea not, if we can do it, to not power off that computer until we've had time to go in with tools that can collect all of that information for us. Now on the other side, if we did power off this computer and did want to collect some information, the hard drive would still be there, and we'd have the data on the hard drive. However, there's kind of a middle ground here too, and that is, if we had some swap file information, let's say, for example, Bob's computer was running a whole bunch of stuff, and it was virtualizing memory, and it had to swap memory space out to the hard disk. If we did power off this drive, we may or may not get some of that swap information, depending on how gracefully this computer went down. For example, if we unplugged it and it just, boom, done, we might get some of that swap. If we powered it down gracefully, that swap file may be deleted. So the swap file regarding the hard drive is a little bit of middle ground as far as volatility. So anything in RAM is the most volatile, and the hard drive itself and its data and files are the least volatile. So what does that mean to you and I? It means if we're going to do data forensics on Bob's computer, we'd want to make sure we do a collection in this order. Start with RAM and tools that will get everything that's temporary and volatile. That would also include any kind of swap space. And then part of our collection procedure would be to gather the information from the hard drive. And the hard drive being the least volatile of all these items. So our first order of business would be to get a system image that includes all the RAM and the cache processes and everything else. And then secondly, to get an image of the actual hard drive on that device. So if this is the hard drive, what we would do is we would create a full disk image of that drive. And it would be a bit by bit image of the drive. It would be special software used with forensics that makes sure we're not modifying or manipulating anything on this drive as you and I create a completely separate bit by bit image of that drive. To help validate our image that we just created, we're also likely going to use a hash function. And we'll run that hash against the original drive. Now, we're not writing anything ever to the original drive because that would compromise the data that's currently there. So we'll run the hashing algorithm against the drive and we'll store that hash somewhere else, not on the physical drive. And then we'll run that same hashing algorithm against our image just to verify that the hashes equal each other. And that is going to verify the data integrity of our image. Now with that image, all truth be told, we'd probably take that image, make a copy of that image, and then from that copy we would do our forensics. And the reason for that is pretty amazing. If we ever need to go back, for example, and prove that we have a bit-by-bit exact image of the original drive, or we have to go to court and maintain a chain of custody regarding protecting the evidence and identifying it hasn't been tampered with or messed with, by working on the copy as we look at the data and work with it, there may be a possibility that we could modify the contents of that data as we're using our tools. But if we have the original bit-by-bit image, we can go back to that one, make another copy, and continue to work off of that copy. We could also, in court or elsewhere, demonstrate based on a hashing algorithm that the hard drive we did the initial copy against is still exactly the same as the original image we copied. Another option that we're very likely to use also is that if we are dealing with a copy of our bit-by-bit image, we'd also probably mount that drive as we take a look at it in read-only mode. And that will also help us prevent introducing any new content to that drive or to our copy of the image of the original drive as we're doing our forensics investigation on that media. And I suppose if we had no other option, we had to work with or look at the original image that we created. If we did mount that in read-only as we looked at it, that would assist us in having a minimal impact regarding changing any of the content if we did mount it in read-only mode. But again, it would be better to work with a copy of our image as opposed to the image itself. Additional information that we might collect might be from other devices in our network. For example, if we have a router or a firewall that are using syslogs, so they're logging information over to a syslog server, that could assist us in identifying traffic that may have been coming from Bob's computer. See, Bob has a layer 2 address on an Ethernet network called a media access control address, also sometimes called a hardware address or a burned-in address. It's 12 hexadecimal digits long, and that information regarding how it's interacting with a layer 2 switch or other devices on the local segment, that information could be added to the data that we can look at from a forensics perspective. There's also an IP address at layer 3 that Bob would be using on this network, and although most customers have IP addresses that are dynamically assigned through a dynamic host configuration protocol server, we could go back and look at the logs as well for the DHCP server to see which IP address had been assigned to Bob's layer 2 address as part of our process of knitting everything together to get a complete picture of what's happening on the network. So that's how network traffic and logs could be used as part of a forensics investigation. Have you ever heard of the term GIGO? It stands for garbage in, garbage out. One of the data points that we might use in forensics is timestamps. For example, on Bob's local computer, maybe there's timestamps for various events that occurred. And on the server, there's a security log that may have the details of when people are logging in and logging out. And let's say that for a moment that this is where the security logs are kept on the server. Now those security logs, they may have universal time coordinated, also known as Greenwich Mean Time. So if Bob is using his local time zone and the date stamps here are in UTC, we'd have to reconcile these events and make sure we knew what the offset was for a given log. So if it was in the Pacific time zone, maybe Bob's logs are PST. Maybe the logs on the server are UTC. And maybe there's some UTM device in the network, Unified Threat Management, doing all kinds of really cool things like application layer inspection and malware protection and intrusion prevention. And we'd also want to be aware of what its time calculations are on the events that it sees. And there's really a couple of factors going on here. Number one, we need to make sure we understand the offset. regarding the time that's in the records that are being looked at. And secondly, we need to make sure that there's accuracy. For example, if we know there's 7 or 8 hours difference between the time that Bob's local computer and UTC is showing, and we can reconcile that because we know the offset, we'd also want to make sure that Bob's computer and the server are not off by, like, say, 5 or 10 minutes. Otherwise, the logs may also be off a little bit. And one method that you and I can implement to help maintain accuracy of the time is the network time protocol. And that can be used with or without security. And what it allows a computer to do is go out to a time server that has the verified correct time and make sure it synchronizes its local clock to the correct time. So after we've reconciled the offset regarding how many hours apart they are, from an accuracy perspective, if they're both using NTP, we don't have to worry as much. And being off by just 5 or 10 minutes is a really big deal if we're trying to correlate logs from one system and another system regarding event or events that are happening on the network. One other example of offset that we ought to be aware of as well is we might have some logs from, for example, a network device like a router. And maybe those events are being logged based on uptime. So for example, if a system has been up for 1 week, 7 days, 3 hours, 25 minutes, and so many milliseconds, and we have logs that are coming out of that system, we'd also have to correlate the offset for that one as well. And to do that, we'd say, when was this system booted? And we say it's March 26th of whatever year. And then from that date, our offset would be 1 week, 7 days, 3 hours, 25 minutes, and however many milliseconds from when it was rebooted. And as a side note, if you do have logging set up that way, where log events include the offset since the system was first rebooted, you may want to rethink that and set it up so it is supplying a date and time that won't be a nightmare to correlate to other events that are happening in the network. And most network devices do have the option of doing logging with a date and timestamp instead of giving an offset of weeks, days, and hours since that system was last rebooted. We touched on hashes already. Hashes give us the ability to verify data integrity. So if we created a system image of RAM and all the registers and all the caches, we could run a hashing algorithm across that. And then later, as we're working with a copy of that system image file, we could run the same hashing algorithm again, and we should get the same hashed result to verify we have integrity from the system image that we took earlier. The same concept applies to the hard drive. We create a bit-by-bit image of the original disk. We run a hashing algorithm across the original disk and our image just to verify we have data integrity, an exact match, if you will, between what we saw originally and the copy we have. And then as we start digging into any of the details, taking a copy of that and working with the copy is going to help us maintain the integrity of the original data that we collected. Another data point that we could use as we look at Bob's computer and we're doing forensics is what was on the screen at the time that it happened. And oftentimes that can be captured with a simple screenshot, whether it's a print screen key on a Windows computer or some other control sequence on another operating system. Collecting what was actually on the screen itself at the time an incident is occurring or shortly after might prove to be valuable if we need to investigate what was on the screen at that time. Now, another resource that we might have is like a janitor. Now, you might ask, well, how is that going to be valuable for forensics? Well, let's say we're looking for witnesses of any strange behavior. And so we interview everybody who was in the building, for example, or in that area for the last 24 hours. And we ask the janitor if he saw anything, and maybe he saw someone in that cubicle or in that office or walking by that office at a specific time. Or anybody else who had eyewitness to something else that maybe was a little bit abnormal or different. And that eyewitness information could help us and assist us as part of the forensics that we're doing on the computer system. Another aspect that I've seen in many companies is a concept called use it or lose it. And what I'm talking about is budget. Let's say, for example, that we did have some security incidents that happened and we had to bring in third-party people to help us do forensics and analysis on what occurred. Well, it's really important to track the man hours and the expense involved with those incidents because it's very likely we're going to want to factor those dollars in to a budget for the next year. And that's really important because if you and I do not have to scramble for budget when we're going to reach out to third parties to assist us with some security breach that we had, we're more likely to actually do that reaching out to get the correct resources with the correct experience who can assist us with our problem. And by documenting the expenses now, that'll help us for the budgets in the future. One critical aspect in the forensics process is that as you and I collect information, whether it's a system image or a disk image or screenshots or anything else that we're collecting and gathering, it's really important to maintain the integrity of that data and not have it be manipulated. And there's a concept called chain of custody that can assist us in demonstrating that the evidence that we've collected has been controlled and handled properly, all the way from A to Z. So for example, we've taken hashes to validate the data integrity of the system image or the disk, and let's say we have the physical disk that we still want to keep as evidence. The chain of custody would include details regarding where it was stored, who had custody of that drive, if it was moved, where it was moved from and to, and during transit, was there opportunity for any compromise of that evidence? And the chain of custody is going to also involve tagging of evidence and a lot of documentation regarding who had it and who had it next and so forth, where it was stored. And if we do a chain of custody correctly, it's going to help us in a court of law, where we might have to demonstrate that the evidence that we're presenting as part of a case is literally the same evidence that we collected as part of our forensics process. And without a proper chain of custody, let's say we have an attacker who's being accused of compromising one of our systems, and from our log files we've identified the IP address that he was coming in from, the attacks he was running, and the malware that he injected onto a specific computer, as an example, on the hard drive. The attacker could argue, hey, that's not the hard drive from Bob's computer. That's some other hard drive. How can you prove that was really Bob's hard drive? And in a court of law, if the prosecuting parties could not prove that was literally the hard drive from the computer in question, and they didn't have a chain of custody detailing where the evidence was stored, how it was handled, the dates and times and all the details of it, it's possible that the hard drive as evidence could be thrown out because of a lack of a solid chain of custody regarding the evidence. And this reminds me of an old saying that says, if you think the price of education is expensive, you ought to try the price of ignorance. And all too often, there are mistakes that are made with the chain of custody or making a valid hash to validate the data integrity of the data that we've collected. And as a result, maybe some of our evidence is not submissible in court. One of the key things we need to do is make sure that we learn as an organization and an individual from every single mistake that we make. So if there is a mistake somewhere in our forensic process, for example, Bob's computer is having a problem and somebody powers it off, thereby losing the opportunity, for example, to do a system image capture. Or as an example, if Bob's computer has the incident and then Bob continues to work on that computer, even after he's called the incident response team, which has the potential to change the data on the disk and in memory because Bob is continuing to use the computer. Whatever the mistakes we learn, whether it's in forensics or in life, all we simply need to do is document those, improve, and not make those same mistakes in the future. It also is a great idea if your internal company doesn't have the expertise regarding forensics to outsource those services from an organization that does have that specific experience, especially if you think it might go all the way to court, where the chain of custody and the hashes and all the other details have to be in place if they're going to be evidence in court. Another trend that I've noticed is more and more people are using big data for part of their forensics analysis. Every day, we've got like 3 brand new exabytes of data. That's 10 to the power of 18. If you want to get a calculator and do that, that's a lot of information. And that would include social media, transaction records, log files, and most of that information is available in a data center somewhere. So as part of forensics, if we have something that's happening on our network, and we want to know more about it, it's very likely that that's happening on somebody else's network as well. And with big data, we might even be able to predict the type of attacks that are coming our direction, or we're more likely to be at risk for, based on using big data. So to take advantage of big data, we first of all have to collect it, meaning we have to have the big data available somewhere. We need to be able to sort through it, and then go ahead and analyze it. And for most companies, that's a service that they're likely to get from cloud computing, from some service up in the cloud that has the horsepower to handle all the data, sort through it, put some context around it, and then use the information as a company wants to analyze certain aspects of their security or their system or their business. So big data is a trend that more and more companies are moving to for lots of purposes, including forensics. And another use of big data outside of forensics is for companies to help identify what their customers want and need and what their customers will buy. For example, a great example is Netflix. The company used big data to create entire series. And they knew before they ever released those series, based on the big data and the analysis of that data, they knew that those shows would be an absolute win with their customers. And if you want to see several examples of that, you could do a Google for big data and Netflix, and there's lots of articles of exactly what they did and how they did it. I've had a great time chatting with you about computer forensics, and I'm glad you joined me for this video. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.